What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Trail, a college baseball recruiting podcast. I'm joined here by fellow host of the podcast, Sam Sharp, and this episode we're going to talk about metrics. Sam, the biggest question I always get is, my kid's a really good baseball player, but he doesn't stand out in a metric-based environment. What is your usual response to that? Because I know it's a hard-hitting, loaded question, but I'm sure it's one you've heard several times before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, looking inside the context of the recruiting process, metrics definitely have a presence, right? We talk about them, as kind of the pre-qualifier, right, of how to start to evaluate your game to a specific level, right? There's always going to be outliers. You can point in, a specific, way of certain guys who, you know, are outside of a certain mold, but you got to kind of stay right within the norms, right? Look at what the averages are for the different levels, and use that as a guiding light as you start to construct what level of play you think is appropriate. When you start to talk about Division One, top 25, top 50 programs, you're looking at a combination of physicality, right? So certain size and weight, and obviously that's going to correlate with strength, and then definitely an athleticism, right? That is going to match the speed of that game, right? So definitely sub 7 runner from a positional player standpoint. If you're going to play in the middle of the field, I would say 6'7", 6'8" are kind of those benchmarks, and it's a way for college coaches, but then also travel ball coaches, high school coaches, advisors, who's ever helping you kind of construct, right, the appropriate game plan and strategy for your recruiting process to really start to funnel down what's going to be a good opportunity for you. Similar effect, now into, arm strength and things like that, right? As the speed of the game, at the highest level of the sport increases, arm strength is more and more important, right? You have a left-handed hitter who's 4-0 down the line. In order to go into the 6 hole at shortstop and make a play, right, and get a put out, it's hard to do that at 81 miles an hour versus a guy who's upper 80s, low 90s, right, and has the ability to either play off platform, right, or off time and rely on arm strength, or as his range and his lateral movements start to increase, has the ability to make throws based on arm strength. This is just one segment of it. From an infield defensive standpoint, right, hands and feet and actions are certainly important, but you know, again, trying to look at easy benchmarks of how to categorize yourself, that's really where the metrics start to play in. I think probably the biggest one always is exit velocity, right? And how diverse the thought process is around that metric. But again, in batting practice, right, which is where we're getting a lot of that type of data, it starts to just give us, insight into how hard you can consistently hit the ball. And I think the one thing, we always talk about with players is your max exit velo is great, but, across, a round of 10, 10 to 15 pitches, where's your average at, right? Are you a guy who can be in the upper 80s, low 90s and play gap to gap with it? That's certainly going to start to open up the door to a Division One level of play, right, as a high school player, versus a guy who's going to be more, low 80s, right, and kind of what that thought process is maybe across, some different levels of college baseball. So, again, these are guiding lights, you know what I mean, in terms of how you start to think about where your game fits. Um, Certain coaches, place more of a hierarchy on some of these things and really want to know where guys are at. Others, not as much. From a position player standpoint, obviously on the mound, velocity is king, right? Like ultimately to play at different levels of the sport, you need to be able to, again, pitch with your fastball at a certain velocity. Yeah, hey, that's great that you run it up to 92, but if you're pitching 87 to 89, right, that's kind of where you fit in terms of that metric. And again, even on the pitching side, there's definitely some pitching coaches that have bought into spin rate and different things that they're going to obtain from Rapsodo or TrackMan data versus guys who are still going to use a radar gun, but then look for other um, things throughout the course of their evaluation to make a yes no decision on a player. So these are all parts of that process and working towards hopefully an offer. But there's no doubt that metrics again start to give us some insight into what your skill set is going to yield within the context of college baseball.
Yeah, and I think there's so many different directions that we can go off of just the initial conversation of putting together metrics and talking about how there's different values and different levels to it. But I think we've gotten to the point where a lot of college coaches, and myself included in the past, and a lot of the people I talk to and communicate with, is they'll tell you metrics don't matter, right? They'll tell you it's about the intangibles. We want ball players, we want high baseball IQs. But I think the pushback, and I would love to know your opinion on this, is the reality is even if they might not be asking, hey, what's his exit velocity or what's his spin rate or what's his 60 time, our eyes are still evaluating whether the metrics can play
No
at
doubt.
our level or not. So what's kind of your take on that? Because we have heard a lot of people switching into the side of metrics don't matter, and there's definitely validity in the like nobody's making an offer versus not making an offer based off of one metric, but there's still the evaluation piece.
100%. You know, um, there was a time, going back, whatever it is, 5, 10 years ago, where the actual numbers weren't as prevalent, right? We didn't have all the technology that we have today, but we were still using a basis of player evaluation on these, metrics, right? A pro style workout has been around for a very long time in our game, right? There's a reason why, whether it's at the professional level, the college level, even a tryout for your club team, why they um, use that as a beginnings, right, of evaluating players, because we have to start to understand tool set and how that fits into the type of players that we're recruiting for our given program. So there's always been an aspect of that. I think that even for the guys who don't want to jump into the numbers, they're still evaluating players based on the tools and obviously how that now correlates to metrics and data. So it's a part of our game, and I think for most people too, it's now a quantitative way, right, to start to really think about player evaluation. There's a lot of subjectiveness in this, right? We were talking before we jumped on the podcast earlier, right? Sometimes, it just comes down to first impressions and a player having a, just okay day versus a really good day and how that affects one coach's versus another's thought process on a kid, right? Those are things that, again, are subjective. They're hard to control in the recruiting process. But if you're a 6'6" runner and you're 90 across the infield and you have some bat speed in the low 70s and you're able to consistently hit the ball, in the low 90s, you're going to have some more attention on you throughout the course of, let's call it the summer evaluation period, or you show up at a camp or a showcase. Those tools are going to be a little bit louder, right? And certainly going to pull in some attention from coaches. And that's the role that this plays. It doesn't disqualify guys, right, who maybe have some more average tools. But, it's something that you have to think about in terms of, most importantly, from a player parent perspective, of how does this set you up for success, right, as a player, right? If you're a guy who is incredibly toolsy, you can be in some more of those data driven showcase opportunities versus, a guy who maybe is a little bit, more average or even slightly below average, but can really play the game, right? I'm sure as a college coach, I know during my time here in the amateur space, like I can think of multiple players who kind of fit that mold, but went on to have great college careers at a really high level because they're very good in between the white lines when it's game time, right? And that's super important as well. But, how you go about evaluating those players is going to be different based on their tool set.
And I think to bring up the point of the guy that's just a ball player too, to kind of build off of that, like metrics quantify what our eyes are seeing. When we talk about a guy just being a ball player, that's gut. That's just feel,
Yeah,
that's instincts, that's seeing it. And I can guarantee this, every college coach has missed on a guy that their gut told them was just better than what the metrics were telling them. And they've also probably hit on a guy. Like we can all pick guys that we've hit
yeah,
on. It's like when you put them in between the white lines, like you're talking about, they're just a gamer. And then they go on, they have an all-American career at whatever level that they go to. But the reality is it was just gut and feel. But metrics are a way to quantify what coaches are seeing with their eyes. That's how I always used it. It wasn't like, hey,
yeah,
again, and I value the metrics. I'm a little younger guy in the coaching space, so there's definitely some points of like, hey, what's his spin rate? How does this play? I understand that if he's a vertically moving fastball, like all this stuff like that comes into play. But the reality is, and I think this is a really good point, and you kind of hinted at there, and I want you to kind of build off of it, is metrics are more important for the families to be able to coordinate the recruiting process and where to go and what events to shine at more than it is for the coaches, right? The coaches will kind of use it to kind of clarify what they're seeing. But I think
sure.
families should embrace that stuff to be able to wrap their head around, okay, where should we be spending our time? Where should we be allocating our funds? Because at the end of the day, it is a fund driven, environment. So build off of that and how you have that conversation with families. And this isn't always about the college coach and the metrics.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think first and foremost, you need to understand how your game is going to play in different exposure settings, right? So if those tools are, elite or, above average, yeah, maybe a PBR or a perfect game showcase where there's a heavy, reliance on those data driven, testing numbers makes sense for you versus a guy who, let's throw out another, example. You're a 7.0 to a 7.05 runner. You're 84, 85 across, from an arm strength perspective, and going to be a little bit more, mid 80s in your BP. It's a little bit more gap to gap, not as much, power flashed in your, in your rounds. Like that guy inside of, a metric driven environment is going to probably be overlooked, versus him, going out with his travel ball team and being out, across some of the bigger tournaments in the summer where, he can really play at a high level and showcase his barrel to ball skills versus good velocity and, command the strike zone in different counts. And these are things that are obviously very important within the recruiting process, more important, right, as you advance to the next level, because everybody's really athletic, everybody's big and strong, right, once you get there. But you have to understand how to market your game, right, and ultimately, leaning on the people in your circle, whoever and trust, and has a feel for these things, should help you dictate the decisions that you're making as a prospect, so that you're putting yourself in a situation to be successful. Um, again, I always like to use examples in these, right, to give it some real life feel. I'd be interested on your perspective on the college coaching side of some guys who maybe fit that, we'll call it, gamer type mold. But, we have a young man who's a freshman right now playing at a mid-major level of college baseball, and his metrics are, slightly below average across the board for that level of play. But, incredible barrel of ball skills as a left-handed hitting infielder. Um, you know, Essentially no swing and miss. Across the at bats that were really pivotal in his recruiting process. Was able to have really good at bats left on left. All these things start to add up, and you look at him and he goes, yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And um, you know, he's gotten to the college level now and be able to lean on those things. But his coaches have still come back to him. I know, after year one, and have said, hey, we want you to get faster, right? We want you to continue to work on your lateral move in the infield. So these things, even though he's progressed through the recruiting process, are still things that are being talked about now in order to take his game to that next level and maximize it, right, over the course of the next 3 years at the college level. So they never really stop, right? At the end of the day, it's a function of putting yourself in a situation to reach your ceiling, right? We talk about that all the way in the recruiting process. It doesn't stop once you get to college. Shoot, I'm sitting here this morning. I get a text from, one of my former players who's a pitcher in the A10 now, and he had his exit meeting, and his coaches don't want him to play summer ball. They want him to come home and put on 10 to 15 pounds and really train, right? So here's the physical part of the conversation. Here's a kid who, pitched quite a bit in the A10, had some really good success in year one, and his coaches are talking about more physical progression. So these are things that are certainly taking place at college. And if you can start to understand them, as a precursor to that, number one, you're setting yourself up for success in the recruiting process, right? And you reaching the ceiling of play that's appropriate for your game. And that should always be the goal as a player. And then, ultimately, you're putting yourself in a situation to be successful at the college level. And, I think one of the things we talk about all the time is making a commitment is great, but that's not the goal, right? You've made a commitment, and you get the Instagram post, right? We all know that the edits
The
part of it.
dopamine hit.
Yeah, no doubt, right? You get the opportunity to maybe have a signing day ceremony at high school during your senior year, which is a really nice moment for your family, and obviously it's the culmination of that point in your career. But these things are fleeting, right? Like they come and go. You have to get to campus now and make it for 4 years, right? So that's the goal. And how you think about the recruiting process and starting with evaluation and the data sets you up for this track record, right? And if you're a younger player and hey, I need to get faster, well, you have to take the time and train towards it, right? Because player development is the secret sauce of what makes the recruiting process go on, for you. So these are all the things that you need to be aware of so that you can best set yourself up for success.
You took the words out of my mouth multiple times there. When you were building the lead up there, I was going to say it's about reaching your ceiling as a player. And that's
Yeah,
ultimately what it comes down to. And you mentioned that in great explanation of a specific player who they want to develop, even though he's a guy that had success, right? Our goal is to build the best baseball players we can be by the time they're juniors and seniors, and hopefully
yeah,
professionally and playing for as long as they can. And that's ultimately where metrics do come into play, because even if you are a guy who has a skill set, everybody's going to want you to get bigger, faster, stronger ultimately. And I know we're going to talk about that, but from my perspective, the only tool that's ever been able to outplay metrics or recruiting rankings or whatever you want to say is barrel skills, bat to ball skills, and being able to not strike out and consistently hit line drives over the infield. If you don't hit the ball hard, but you never strike out and you're consistently on the barrel, line drive focus, you're going to have success. Every kid that I've seen that has outperformed what they've done in a metric-based environment does that. So if you're a parent, you're a player, you're listening to this right now, start keeping track of your strikeouts, right? If you're striking out more than a strikeout per game and you're not hitting the ball hard, that's another metric that we can now use to reevaluate where we stand in the recruiting process. Now, if you're a guy who strikes
for
out
sure.
a lot of kids 2 times in their high school season and you only hit the ball, a little bit softer than you intend to, okay, maybe you have some legitimacy there, but still, that doesn't guarantee anything. The guys that I see that have really good barrel awareness and really good barrel skills that have success, go to smaller schools. They go to smaller schools and they have a ton of
Yeah,
success, and that's where they reach their ceiling as a player, and then potentially, develop into something that's good enough to have opportunities outside of that. But it really comes down to, I've never seen a kid with so much power and they end up at a school and then it's just like somehow they find to the ability to find barrel on baseball, and
for
and
sure.
coaches knew that. No, most of those guys that have a ton of power go to the top level, struggle, and then come back and then develop, right? Like it's the whole fluidity of the process. But really the only skill that outperforms metrics and is quantifiable in this nature is how much do you swing and miss, how much do you strike out. And that's the one tool that has had a ton of success, at least in my opinion, of guys that go on to outperform what you expect.
No doubt. You're not going to evaluate that in a BP round, though, right? At a
Nope.
showcase. So again, it's a extremely important tool. It's something that is certainly being evaluated by college coaches, but the a certain setting is required, right, for them to make that decision on a player. If that
Mm-hmm.
is your best attribute offensively, hey, you need to think about how that plays into your exposure, strategy. Um, Even if you have some other tools, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, hey, maybe you are a 6'7" runner and there's some arm strength across the infield. But like, if the BP round is going to be, let's call it, just flash contact, from gap to gap over the infielders in front of the outfielders, going and taking 14 swings at a pro style workout probably isn't going to turn a lot of heads. I think, again, we can talk about, how the recruiting process plays out. Um, Ultimately, I tell this to families all the time, like, we don't get to make the rules, right? We react to what the environment is, right? And this is the way that showcases are run, right? Ultimately, what you're going to be asked to do. So if that doesn't play to your strengths, you have to think about, is that the best place for me? It's not a good player, bad player conversation. It's about, how does my game, my skill set fit into that setting? Ultimately, there's a lot of different pathways, right, to college baseball. It's about putting yourself in what's right for me as a player. You look at, again, guys who we can talk about swing mechanics or swing and miss, but they're going to get into a BP round and hit the ball to the wall, gap to gap. You know, Coaches are going to take notice of that. They're going to want to
Mm-hmm.
learn more. It doesn't mean that he's an offer guy, right? Because there might be holes in his game that are going to be evaluated throughout the process going forward that show that he can't play at a particular level. But inside of that setting, that bat speed, that exit velocity, whether we have the numbers or not, are going to stick out to the college coaches that are present in that moment.
And I think I can speak for most hitting coaches in saying, because I became victim to this, where if a guy has big exit velocity and things like that, you trust your system and you say, we can fix swing and miss. Some coaches think they're more likely to add strength and power and trust their strength conditioning. But I know from
Sure.
my standpoint, that was what I felt was my strength, and our system at Arcadia was our strength as a group, right? Like, we didn't strike out, we talk out, like, we really
Right.
emphasize it, we practice those things. So you think that a guy with more strength is a guy that's going to prosper in your system rather than a guy who already does what you do well. Where's the development and where's reaching the ceiling, right? And that's
Right.
one of the conversations that each college coach has their preference, right? There's nothing I love more. I can tell you, I nerd out, right?
Right.
Left-handed hitting, middle infielder, tall, lanky, and projectable frame, doesn't strike out a ton, has natural backspin when he hits a ball in BP. Like, you give me one of those and I will be salivating at the mouth. Like, doesn't matter the
Sure.
level I was at, all the stuff like that. But some coaches want the big donkey who can hit a ball off the pole every swing in BP and maybe top spins a couple balls in there and things like that. So, like, all coaches are going to have their preference, and we can't play matchmaker, right? We can't, as parents, we can't, as me and you, as directors of showcase and advisors, we can't play matchmaker. At the end of the day, the
Yep.
evaluation process has to take shape, and the coach has to want you to be in their position, which I think, again, there's so many different directions that I'd love to go to, but this brings me to, you mentioned it as the transitive property. Like, we can't, I think this is one of the biggest flaws that parents and players make collectively is, well, I went 3 for 4 off of an NC State commit. That means that I'm good enough to play at NC State. Well, that's where the metrics come into play. So I know this has probably come up in conversations a lot of times with you, but I feel like that's the biggest thing is they've seen guys go D1. But as I always like to
Mm-hmm.
say, the gap between D1 and D3 is a smidge. It's not that big. And there's thousands of players within that smidge that could be the difference from you. And you could be good enough to get a hit off of that kid today. But I think the goal
Sure.
is the projection of what that kid looks like at 22 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. The transitive property has no presence in the recruiting process. Let's make that statement a certainty. Um, I think ultimately, right? Again, when you start to talk about evaluating players, on-field success, right? Hey, I went 3 for 4 versus that player doesn't tell me a lot about the skill set, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you as a recruiting coordinator and making evaluations and decisions on players, how many times did you ask for their high school stats, right? Or ask for, hey, what's his batting average this summer? What's his OPS this summer? Like, those conversations aren't taking place. for most programs, right? Again, certain programs might prioritize different things as they start to try and learn about players. But I would say that the vast majority of college coaches don't partake in those conversations. So
Mm-mm.
again, why do metrics have a place and a presence in the process? Because those are, whether we're talking about the specific number or just how it correlates to a skill set, those are the conversations that are being had.
Yeah.
And that's what the coaches are keyed in on, hence why it's important to players and families.
Mm-hmm. And I think that brings in like the only time that any college coach, it was never something that I would do because whenever you get, oh, this kid hit 500 in high school, it's like, yeah, but who was he playing against, right? Or not all hits are created equal. Like I would always say like a fly out to the warning track in center hit hard is I'm going to circle your name, but a bloop single doesn't get you circled. And you could hit 40
Okay.
bloops in a summer and you could hit, and the other player could hit 40 flyouts to the track and you could be hitting 450 and he could be hitting 250, but that kid may have the offers that you think you should be getting. And I think that's, again, the only time I could see a college coach valuing stats in a high school season is if they're local to the area and they know the talent that is in that conference, right? Like,
Sure.
so like a Philly kid, a Philly school with a Philly kid in a Philly conference, right? Like
Sure.
yeah, like I
Yeah.
know I've seen this, I've seen the kids come through.
Yeah.
I know what 450 means at Malvern Prep, right? Compared to any other
Yeah.
school. But like outside of that, it's not something that comes up in any evaluation. It's what does he look like? How do we think his swing plays in film and all the things like that? And I think that's the nuanced conversation of results don't matter in the recruiting process. No, like
Yeah.
never once, like, can it help you stand out? Yeah, if you hit 700 in a high school season, a college coach is probably going to go, well, like that's intriguing. But again, it's going to be who did you play against? And if it's not
Sure.
high level competition that the college coach has seen you play against, they're not going to be comfortable to just shoot you an offer and be like, hey, you have a roster spot just because you hit 700 in local high school baseball and without full context of what that conference is.
No doubt. And I think just context of what went on in that particular game, right? I mean, was out at a high school game in New York City a few weeks ago. Had a Division One recruiting coordinator at the game, right, evaluating a pitcher, and we look up and I'll say it was like the fifth or sixth inning, and he'd given up 5 hits. One was a ball that the second baseman just sat back on and threw it over to first base, and the batter runner beat it, and the scorekeeper gave it a hit. There was a ball chopped over the mound that the shortstop just didn't get to. I don't think the ball made it to the second base bag. There was a little flare in the triangle behind second base, and
Mm-hmm.
then there was a slow roller down the third base line, and then one legitimate hit. Right, guy squared up a ball, a double in the backside gap to right center field, and you look up and there's 5 hits in 5 innings, and you know you know it's just not the case, right? Like
Yeah.
those 4 balls in the infield are outs at our level. Like you can't,
Mm-hmm.
that just doesn't have a place inside of the evaluation process. So you don't spend any time talking about it, right? In terms of the box score, his line versus velocity versus
Yes.
the shape of the breaking ball, the size and physicality of the player, the arm speed. Again, not that you're putting a quantifiable number on arm speed, but you go down the third base line and you look at this guy and you just see it, right? You know it.
Yeah.
It's a metric, it's a data point for us, but it starts to give us really good insight into the fact that there's most likely more velocity to come down the line, right? And this is a
Mm-hmm.
guy who you project to be low to mid 90s at some point on campus. Those are
Yep.
the things that are generating interest for prospects.
Mm-hmm.
The line of 5 hits is inconsequential.
Yep. I always love the whippy arm action, right? Like the second
Yeah,
you stand out, like a guy like at our level, it's a little bit different, but 78 to 82 from the right side with whippy arm action, tall, lanky, athletic, like you hope, and again, this is where you need to trust your pitching coach and your player development, that guy could be 85 to 87 if in the right
sure.
situation. Like that's what it all comes down to compared to, maybe a maxed out frame with a little bit slower, but kind of like effort filled mechanics that's currently 83 to 85. It's like, okay, well, are we comfortable with that guy at 83 to 85 for the next 4 years, right? Like,
Sure.
because it looks like he already moves the right way. And those are some things that stand out again. And it's all the nuance of evaluation. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. And again, we can't play matchmaker on the other side. We have our biases as well as college coaches. But I think with this conversation, right, we're 30 minutes into this conversation. We could go in a billion different directions. The big thing is like, how do we improve our metrics, right? So ultimately it does, like, people want to see these things, the things we can't improve. Height, right? And height is a metric, and weight, we can improve weight, but we want to make sure it's good weight. We'll talk
Yeah.
about that. But height is a metric. You could check the 60 box, you could hit the ball, a certain mile per hour, you can throw the ball a certain mile per hour, you can do everything that every college coach. But if you're 5'4", that might limit what you're able to do. Right now, exit velocity does kind of
Sure.
change the dynamic of that. But just saying, in a hypothetical scenario, height, it does matter. But let's talk about just getting bigger, faster, stronger. And obviously, you mentioned the caveat to moving better as well.
Yeah, I think those things are definitely there's a correlation between those aspects and metrics. And um, the reality is in today's baseball landscape, like you better have a really good weight room routine, right, and really understand how to train in that capacity. Uh, Obviously, being in the weight room is great, but the differentiator is the programming and the different nuanced components of that. And, for players out there, they're in an age of really unlimited resources, right? When it comes to these things, there are some unbelievable strength coaches, across all different regions. You have, uh, some tremendous remote programming options now with technology that's available. I think, if you're, um, in a situation where you're price conscious and willing to invest the time and the energy, probably you could go through Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and dive into some high level people in this space and be able to start to just create some of your own programming that's better than most. So
Mm-hmm.
if there's a will, there's a way, and I think that um, the investment from a time standpoint and energy standpoint in the weight room is imperative in today's recruiting and baseball landscape. There's just no other way about that, right? Ultimately, it's a separator for guys, and when you show up, at a game as a college coach, right? We buy with our eyes, and if you see a guy who looks good in the uniform, again, interest is peaked, and whether that's fair or not, it's part of it. Um, we have a young man who's a high school senior right now. He's committed to a mid-major Division One program. Um, and he did a post grad because the physicality part was really the piece that was missing. You know what I mean? He had good skills and good tools, but guys would show up and the uniform was baggy on him.
Yep.
He had scrawny build, I would say, and some chicken legs, I guess is another good way to say it. And um, you know, that was the overwhelming feedback from coaches for the good part of a year with this player. All of a sudden, over the course of an off season, he adds 15 pounds and, he goes to a camp, and this was a coach that had seen him play, a few times prior to it. And just the physical changes with him was enough to get that program to give him an offer. And that came
If you
from
Yeah.
weight room,
Mm-hmm.
nutrition, and having a really good plan of how to execute his off season, and that was the difference maker for him.
Yeah. If you are not abusing the weight room at this point in time, you are doing yourself a disservice in all of this conversation, right? You want your metrics to get better. You want your game to get better. You want any aspect of the recruiting process to go smoother and better. You need to be
Yep.
abusing the weight room. Again, the best players, I'm sure you have been around, I've been around. It's not always there are outliers that are just naturally talented enough to get those opportunities that they're looking for based solely off of just talent alone. But the best baseball players that we've all been around are also the hardest workers. You brought up looking good in a uniform, right? That was going to be what I was going to ask you. How many times has a college coach said that to you, or how many times have you used that as a thing that's what you like in a kid? Looks good in a
Yeah.
uniform. I went out to a decent amount of high school games. You go out to a decent amount of high school games. The first thing I noticed the first time I was back out at a high school game is man, do these kids look bad in uniforms, right? Comparatively speaking. And I'm not saying they have bad
Yep.
bodies or anything like that. You get these kids in shorts and t-shirts and they're bigger, faster, stronger than they've ever been. When I was coming through the high school ranks, nobody looked like they do nowadays. Nobody lifts as much. But again, we're not using it enough if our ultimate goal is to be the best baseball player we can. Because I get out to these high school games, it's just like there's a difference between the college kid in a baseball uniform. Pants don't look baggy. They're snug fit. And yeah, sure, maybe the big schools, they have tailors and they get their pants fitted and the jerseys fit a little bit tighter. All of that stuff matters. But again, if we go side to side with a college baseball program, D1, D2, or D3, the
Yep.
physicality is going to be the biggest difference. And if you can check that box in the recruiting process, that is one question mark a coach. Not only does it prove that you work hard, you have discipline, you have an understanding and knowledge of how to develop yourself as a player, which is important, but it also just checks a box that a college coach doesn't have to dream on your potential. You're already kind of there, and you trust me, your metrics are going to translate. Like 100%, I'd be confident that if you got bigger, faster, stronger in the weight room, your metrics, your speed, your exit velocity, your velocity on the mound, every metric that you want to check a box to is going to go up, and you're going to be in a better position to be recruited. So every kid should be abusing the weight room because it's going to pay dividends in the recruiting process.
100%. Couldn't say it better myself.
Perfect. Well, that'll do for the metrics conversation. We're going to have plenty of other conversations. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about showcases and camps, which kind of goes hand in hand with the metrics conversation. So if you like what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe to the Backside Ground Balls Media YouTube channel. We have a whole bunch of information with the recruiting process. We're going through this whole catalog, and we want to make sure we're a resource for everybody who wants to learn more about this process. So thank you for tuning into this episode of The Trail.